Introduce Morgan Peterson, and Morgan is the John C. Bailey 75 and Elizabeth A. Hole 75 Schur Scholar. Morgan worked with Professor Gorey, and so she's going to talk about their research.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Morgan Peterson. I'm a rising junior at Stonewall College. I'm a computer engineering major. So this summer I worked on computer science research with Professor Sandor. Before I begin, I just want to give a brief content warning. My research is all about hate speech, so as you can see, explainable hate speech detection for the web. Because of this, I have had to read through lists and lists of hate comments. I've tailored them specifically today to be a little bit less uncomfortable, but they're still about self-harm, and those topics are going to come up a lot during my presentation. So I wanted to give everybody a heads up, just in case that's a sensitive topic for people. Didn't want anyone to be blindsided. Let's make sure it's on. Thank you. So before I get started, I kind of just wanted to talk about online moderation in general. So I'm sure a lot of us here have been on social media in the past, and the goal of social media is to provide a platform where free speech is available and accessible for all, but that comes with a lot of restriction to make it a reasonable and respectful place for all as well. So we have acquired a content of moderation on social media, starting with human moderation. So that's when a literal moderator, that is their job, to go through comments and posts to limit the amount of hate speech or hateful speech online. There are a few pros to this. We can have like content-specific moderation. A huge con about this is, in social media these days, it has become unreasonable with the amount of comments that are online. There are many studies that have said that this can be actually traumatic to our human researchers. I can attest, not to the traumatic part, but reading through comments is hard, especially if they are hateful towards many communities. So we have moved a little bit more towards automated moderation. Significantly faster and more realistic for the amount of comments online. One big comment I've noticed is it's super unreliable. I'm sure if anyone online used social media before, you've noticed that there are still hate comments, and there are things that are over-moderated or under-moderated. So right now it's in its unreliable era, if you will, and it can be difficult to explain. And so that's kind of where we started, me and my professor on our research. So we had a list of questions to consider. These are some things that popped up often in our Thursday talks. So our first one is this idea of a hate speech benchmark. Now, we kind of kept coming circularly to this conclusion that there is no one person or one community that can determine what hate speech is for everybody. So we have these questions like, who determines what is or what is not hate speech, and how does that differ between communities? Because something that I can determine as hate speech for my community, someone in another community might not determine to be hate speech. For example, like I can speak to people who have one arm, and if that's hateful to people who have one arm, I cannot speak to someone who has one leg. That's not in my community. Something that I could see as hateful may not be hateful to them. Our next question or topic we kind of have to think of is satirical and context-based. AI has a big problem with recognizing what is or is not satirical versus a human. I can look at a comment and be like, oh, obviously they were joking. AI doesn't really do that. It kind of just looks at the words and their definitions. On top of this, I always had this question of what if something is historical or educational or historical in context, but is hateful in out of context. So that could be something like, oh, I'm talking about Reconstruction online. I'm talking about critical race theory online. I'm talking about the civil rights movement online. If I'm using words, topics, themes that are hateful, how does that work into the education sphere? So that's our second kind of concept that we were thinking. One thing that I hear complaints about a lot from people who just use social media are the unclear requirements surrounding what I can or cannot post. So how does a user know what they can post if there seems to be no rhyme or reason to what is being taken down? Oh, I posted something and I don't think it's hateful, but I got shadow banned. How does that happen, and how do I know how to prevent it? And this last question is can the average user understand how AI-based moderation works? And this all, again, comes back to the users. These two last questions are about the users in general. So as maybe some of us know, like younger communities have turned towards slang-based, like to get around these. So it's like, when we look at the unclear requirements, if I'm posting something and I don't want to use the word kill, do I say unalive? Can AI recognize that? Can a text classifier recognize that? These are kind of the questions that me and my professor had going into this summer. So this is kind of the layout of how online moderation works currently. So user will post a comment, and then we go through these 3 steps of API calls, and then we get to the comment is taken down. Now, those middle steps can get very muddy when it comes to someone who may or may not know how AI-based moderation works. Now, an API call, is that familiar to most people in this room? Probably not. It's familiar to me. I've been working on it this summer. But API stands for Application Programming Interface. It is a way for me, someone who's working in computer science, to communicate to a software. So in this case, I'm communicating with ChatGPT. We'll get to that in a second. So that's where we get something like this. This is an API call. This is a snippet of code that I have written this summer. And to its right is an example of the output I would get from the API call. Now this is not familiar to most, this is not easy to read. So basically all this is saying is I put a comment into an API, which talks to ChatGPT's moderation endpoint. And it gives me back this list of category scores. Now looking at this list of category scores, you can't super understand what is this comment even saying, right? What is this even giving to us? So we look at our input on the code example. I have comment what you want to test, that's here in the blue. And that could be something like our hate speech example, like our common example, right? We put this into the OpenAI moderation endpoint, which is ChatGPT's base company, and it spits out its API, the application programming interface, spits out this list of category scores. Now, that's, again, like I said, hard to read, so we wanted to go through and see how a user who may or may not know how API calls work or how endpoints work to understand this information. Now, all this information is a probability that a comment contains these categories. So if you look at the top, we have a list of categories: sexual harassment, hate, illicit violence, self-harm, violence, like all these types of things. Now look at these crazy numbers. Some of them are in scientific notation. We regard those as 0. But if you look down at violence, it's the second from the bottom, you have 0.8599. Now what this refers to is our moderation endpoint is 85.99% sure that violence might be in this comment. But like I said, nobody wants to go through every comment and comb through all of these category scores and what you would get out from the moderation endpoint. So that's where we come kind of to our question about creating a prototype. How can we help users build mental models about moderation systems and better understand the way that their speech is moderated online? So as I was trying to create my prototype, it kind of started like this. Yeah, it started, as most great ideas starts, it starts on a whiteboard. And me and my friends, you can see like horrible text, variance, classifier API. And so basically what we wanted is a way for users to visualize how hate speech is moderated online. And so we started with this idea that, we could have a list of text comments that we skimmed from online, and then some kind of visual something that showed us how likely it would be to be taken down, or what it would be flagged if I were to post this, right? And then we have my notebook of all my things that I like to do during the summer. Make it work right, make it work best, the motto of computer programmers. And so from there, okay, from there it kind of turned into this. So I wanted to see what I wanted it to look like, right? So we have my Canva rendition of what I wanted my webpage to look like. And so we can see this is where the comments come in. We can see on the right, we have a comment surrounding self-harm. Now I have 3 variants that you could choose as the user to see how they would react, how like an API would react, right? So we have our first variant, and that's going to be a chatbot rewrite. So I want to say, hey, what if I plugged my comment into ChatGPT, a chatbot, and what would I get back from that? Like, what if I wanted to use that as my way to rephrase my words, right? So what I have it do is I wanted something that could basically run my comment through ChatGPT, give me back something new, see how that affects its hateful like percentages. Then I wanted to have something like a user rewrite. Because what if I wanted my user to be able to put their own spin on the comment or put their own comment in and see how it reacts? Then the bottom one comes back to that slang rewrite about what I said earlier about people trying to switch out words. We wanted to see, do text classifiers, which is a version of AI, do text classifiers, are they able to recognize when slang words are switched out? Is slang prevalent enough online for AI to recognize that? Can we get around, can people get around hateful speech and AI moderation by using slang words? So this is kind of what I want it to look like. It would be a little bit easier to read. Main problem, you can't really read any of it, so that was a big design flaw. But I also wanted to make sure that people who were using it felt safe to use it. That's where we get this content warning screen in. My intention was to allow the user to select different categories that they weren't okay with seeing. Because I didn't want someone to be blindsided by a topic that they were like, ooh, I did not sign up for this. So that's what that screen is for. That allows them to choose, I've had things in my past where I cannot read self-harm comments. That's just not going to be an option for me. They can still use this tool by selecting to not see self-harm comments. So this is where we get to the end of the summer, kind of what I've been working for. So this is a recording of how my prototype works. So if you see, we have my graphs and we have my comments, and I'm choosing to do a user rephrase on the first, I think a slang rephrase on the second, and a chatbot rephrase on this third comment. Now all of these have to do with self-harm, hence the title at the top. So we have our original graphs, how they're originally scored, and if you can see right there, it switches where my slang rephrase is in and my chatbot rephrase is in. And then I go back up to the top, and I'm asking myself, okay, what words do I think is flagging this as self-harm and violence? So I went in and I took out a couple words. I'm taking out a couple words. And then I'm going to hit update graph 1. So this is where you can see my graph go down. And you can see it on the slang rephrase as well. So this is the new updated percentages of hate scores. We're going to update graph 3 as well. So that's kind of how my prototype works. You take an original comment, you can edit it in 3 different ways, and then you can re-update the graph to see how your edits impacted the hate scores. So if we can look a little bit more in depth. That's what I wanted. There we go. You can look a little bit more in depth about how it works. This is the original comment and then the edited comment. I took out 2 words. I thought that the word knife and the word punish were the words that were flagging for self-harm and violence. Turns out that probably is the main reason that this was flagged for self-harm and violence. We see our self-harm score go from 85–90% down to like 15 to 18%. So that's a pretty significant drop. We see that with our violence score go down as well. Now when we go to the chatbot rephrase, we can see that the content, the words themselves changed, but the content of the speech really didn't. And that's how we see there's a less drop in our score, a less drastic drop in our score than our last one. Oh, these are messed up. Okay, so this is backwards, I don't know how this happened, but these graphs, if we look on the right, are the actual chatbot rephrase. So you can see the lack of drop. I'll go back so you can show the slang rephrase in a little bit. But I wanted to call attention to these words like probs and min, where they're switching out letters with numbers. So this was really the thing that I wanted to notice about slang rephrase. Can a text classifier recognize when a letter is switched out with a number? As a lot of people often do on social media, we'll say like, oh, they won't recognize it if I put a pound sign in. they won't recognize it if I switch it up to 0. And what turns out, let's go back to the other one so you can see the graphs, turns out it actually does significantly impact it. We had a virtual self-harm score of about 50%. That dropped down to probably about 10%. So this is saying that this specific moderation cannot recognize when letters and numbers are switched out. Now this is OpenAI's content moderation. There is another content moderation type called SiteEngine. I used their comment filtering system to originally take my common data set and put it into my sensor data set. However, I did not use it to update these graphs. What I'm interested in is SiteEngine promotes itself to be able to notice this. So something I'd like to do is see if that specifically, that SiteEngine moderation system would recognize that, would we have as much as it can. But some things I can do in the future, right? We want to do a user study, or we have the option to do a user study. We want to focus on whether or not a human who is viewing these sees this as over-moderation or under-moderation. If I show them a comment and I show them how it's moderated, do you recognize that that's over-moderated or under-moderated? But again, we want to come back to that question of who determines that hate speech benchmark and how does it differ by community. So we want to make sure that this is demographically based because we want to take into consideration what the user's viewpoint is on those hate comments in general. Does race impact the way things are over-moderated or under-moderated? Does sexuality impact the way you think something is over-moderated or under-moderated? Do you think something is over-moderated in one community or under-moderated in another community? That's kind of the things that we want to see if we were going to do a user study. The other thing we kind of want to look into is this idea of an adversarial attack. Now, an adversarial attack is a way to edit a prompt into either an API or a chatbot to see if, to get more information about how that specifically works. And so we find these border cases like we see here, similar to a technique for hacking AI systems, and then what can we learn about AI moderation, how AI moderation works by hacking it. So it's the idea of, can I change one word that basically has no effect on the way that a human can read these inputs, but it really drastically changes the way that some kind of text classifier, a type of AI, will view the hate levels of this information. So that's kind of something that we want to look into because there's really no easy way to get information out of an AI moderation, like the API moderation endpoint. Like I said earlier, you get a long list of random scores. You don't necessarily know how they relate to each other. We know that there's like a probability of if something is hateful or not. However, social media platforms themselves determine the threshold. So say, like I said on the earlier one, it had a violence score of 85.99%. Now, maybe that's moderated for a social media company A, where their threshold is 70%. Anything over 70% gets moderated. Now, for social media B, their moderation threshold may be 90%. Now, I don't know what I can or cannot post based on thresholds, because those aren't available to the public at the time. And so this is where that idea of adversarial attack comes in. Where does one thing get flagged as threatening and the other thing get flagged as non-threatening? Where does that come into play? And so that's something that me and my professor have talked about probably the majority of this summer, kind of like how do adversarial attacks work and how can we use them in the future. Now that's kind of the end of what I've been working on this summer. I wanted to give a special thanks to John Bailey and Elizabeth Cole. They do a lot of good work and are really supportive of this from the community to allow us to do cool things like this, short program like this. I want to thank Snowfield College and the Short 2026 program for allowing me and all my peers to do research like this throughout the summer. And then especially I want to thank Professor Sam Gorey for all of this hard work he did this summer to help do my project.